The story of SALT, I and SALT II, begins not with optimism, but with exhaustion, as the superpowers of the Cold War reached a point where the relentless logic of escalation had produced arsenals so vast, so complex, and so dangerous that even the architects of deterrence began to doubt whether the system they had built could remain under control, because by the late 1960s, the nuclear arms race was no longer about gaining advantage, but about managing a momentum that seemed to operate independently of political intent, driven by bureaucracies, doctrines, and technological competition that rewarded accumulation rather than restraint. For more than 2 decades after the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union had pursued nuclear superiority through cycles of action and reaction, each new weapon system justified as a response to the other's perceived gains, resulting in an ever-expanding array of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, strategic bombers, and warheads measured not in dozens, but in the tens of thousands. This accumulation was defended publicly as deterrence, yet privately it produced deep unease among military planners and political leaders who understood that the sheer scale of these forces magnified the risk of accidental war, miscalculation, or unauthorized launch, particularly as early warning systems, command and control networks, and decision timelines became increasingly compressed. The Cuban Missile Crisis had revealed just how close this system could come to catastrophe, and while it ended without nuclear exchange, it left behind a lingering recognition that survival had depended less on perfect planning than on restraint, luck, and human hesitation under pressure. In the years that followed, both superpowers continued to build weapons, but the confidence that escalation guaranteed security began to erode, replaced by a growing awareness that unchecked competition might lead not to stability, but to systemic failure. This shift was reinforced by technological change, as advances in missile accuracy and warhead miniaturization threatened to undermine the logic of mutual assured destruction by creating incentives for first strike, especially against fixed targets like land-based missile silos, raising fears that a crisis could spiral rapidly if either side believed its deterrent was at risk. Within this environment, the concept of arms control, once dismissed as naive or dangerous, gained traction as a means of slowing the race rather than winning it, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. Arms control was reframed not as disarmament, but as a form of strategic management, a way to impose limits on competition so that deterrence could remain credible and controllable. For the United States, this reassessment was driven by a combination of factors, including the immense financial cost of maintaining nuclear superiority, domestic pressure to redirect resources toward social programs, and the realization that numerical advantage no longer translated into meaningful security. For the Soviet Union, similar pressures were at work, compounded by economic constraints and the recognition that matching American technological advances indefinitely would strain an already rigid system. Both sides also faced internal debates, as military establishments resisted limits that threatened budgets and prestige, while civilian leaders struggled to assert control over arsenals that had grown beyond direct political oversight. The emergence of strategic parity further altered calculations, as by the late 1960s, the Soviet Union had achieved the ability to inflict unacceptable damage on the United States even after absorbing a first strike, rendering the pursuit of absolute superiority increasingly pointless. This parity did not produce trust, but it did produce a form of mutual recognition, an understanding that neither side could escape vulnerability, and that stability depended on preventing sudden shifts that might tempt preemption. It was within this context that the strategic arms limitation talks, known as SALT, began, not as a bold leap toward peace, but as a cautious attempt to put brakes on a machine that threatened to run out of control. The talks were initiated during a period of détente, when both superpowers sought to reduce tensions without resolving ideological rivalry, creating space for negotiation even as suspicion remained deep. The very act of negotiating limits on nuclear weapons was itself unprecedented, requiring each side to accept a degree of transparency about forces that had long been shrouded in secrecy, and to acknowledge implicitly that stability was a shared interest rather than a zero-sum contest. SALT I, which culminated in 1972, focused on freezing certain categories of strategic weapons rather than reducing them, reflecting the limited ambition of the effort and the political constraints under which it operated. The centerpiece of SALT I was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which restricted the deployment of missile defense systems, a counterintuitive move that recognized that defenses could be destabilizing by undermining mutual vulnerability and encouraging first-strike thinking. By limiting missile defenses, both sides accepted that security rested on the ability to retaliate, not on the illusion of protection, a profound admission in a system built on deterrence. Alongside the ABM Treaty, an interim agreement capped the number of land-based and submarine-launched ballistic missile launchers, formalizing the existing balance without rolling it back, and signaling a willingness to accept parity rather than chase dominance. These agreements were celebrated publicly as milestones, yet they were also deeply contested, criticized by hardliners as concessions that locked in vulnerability, and by skeptics as cosmetic measures that failed to address warhead numbers or qualitative improvements. Nevertheless, SALT I marked a turning point, establishing arms control as a permanent feature of superpower relations and creating mechanisms for verification, dialogue, and crisis communication that would shape future negotiations. The process itself revealed how difficult it was to impose restraint on systems designed for competition, as negotiators grappled with technical details, definitional disputes, and the problem of ensuring compliance in an environment of deep mistrust. Even as limits were agreed, both sides continued to modernize their arsenals within those limits, exploiting ambiguities and loopholes that allowed for qualitative improvements, demonstrating that arms control did not end the race but altered its form. SALT II emerged from this dynamic as an attempt to extend and deepen the framework established in 1972, addressing the growing complexity of strategic forces and the destabilizing potential of multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIR-Vs, which allowed a single missile to carry multiple warheads aimed at different targets. MIR-Vs epitomize the paradox of the arms race, increasing destructive power while undermining stability by making first strikes more attractive and reducing the survivability of fixed assets. Negotiating limits on such systems proved extraordinarily difficult, as each side sought to preserve flexibility while preventing the other from gaining advantage, leading to protracted talks marked by compromise, delay, and persistent suspicion. Throughout this period, the underlying motivation remained consistent: a shared fear that the nuclear balance had become too complex, too automated, and too unforgiving to be left entirely to competitive logic. SALT II, though never formally ratified by the United States, represented the high watermark of this effort, reflecting an understanding that slowing the arms race was not an act of weakness, but an attempt to preserve control in a system that threatened to overwhelm its creators. The significance of SALT I and SALT II lies not in the weapons they eliminated, but in the mindset they represented, a recognition that the Cold War could not be managed solely through accumulation and deterrence, and that survival in the nuclear age required limits, communication, and an uneasy acceptance of mutual vulnerability. These agreements did not end the arms race, nor did they resolve the ideological conflict between East and West, but they marked the moment when the superpowers began, however cautiously, to acknowledge that the logic driving their competition might ultimately destroy them if left unchecked, setting the stage for a new phase of the Cold War, in which restraint became a strategic necessity rather than a moral aspiration. As SALT II took effect in the early 1970s, its immediate impact was less about reducing danger than about revealing how deeply the Cold War had become trapped inside systems that no longer responded cleanly to political intent. Because the agreements froze certain numbers while leaving untouched the underlying momentum of technological competition, allowing both superpowers to claim restraint, even as they continued to refine and expand their destructive capacity within agreed limits. In Washington and Moscow alike, military planners quickly adapted, redirecting resources toward areas not explicitly constrained by the treaty, particularly the qualitative improvement of delivery systems, guidance accuracy, and warhead design, developments that quietly reshape the strategic balance without violating the letter of the agreements. This dynamic exposed a central paradox of arms control, that limiting one dimension of competition often intensified others, as bureaucracies trained to maximize advantage sought new avenues to demonstrate relevance and preserve institutional power. Nevertheless, the existence of formal limits altered the psychology of the rivalry, introducing the idea that stability was something to be managed collectively rather than imposed unilaterally, and that some forms of superiority were not only unattainable, but dangerous. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, in particular, forced both sides to accept a counterintuitive truth that defending against nuclear attack could be more destabilizing than remaining vulnerable, because effective missile defenses would encourage first strike calculations by undermining the certainty of retaliation. This acceptance of mutual vulnerability ran directly against decades of military thinking, and its endurance depended less on trust than on the shared recognition that the alternative was an arms race with no logical endpoint. At the same time, the political context in which SALT operated remained fragile, as détente coexisted uneasily with proxy conflicts, ideological competition, and domestic skepticism, particularly in the United States, where critics argued that arms control masked Soviet expansionism and constrained American freedom of action. These critiques gained traction as global events eroded confidence in cooperation, including conflicts in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, which reinforced the perception that while strategic weapons were being limited, geopolitical rivalry continued unabated. Within the Soviet Union, similar tensions emerged, as military leaders worried that limits on launchers would lock in perceived disadvantages and restrict future options, while civilian officials balanced these concerns against economic realities that made endless expansion unsustainable. The process of verification became a focal point of contention, as both sides relied on national technical means, such as satellite reconnaissance rather than intrusive inspections, reflecting deep mistrust, but also a tacit agreement to accept a certain level of opacity to preserve political feasibility. This reliance on indirect verification reinforced the importance of stability in observable patterns, making sudden changes or ambiguous deployments particularly dangerous because they could be misinterpreted as treaty violations or preparations for attack. As the 1970s progressed, the strategic environment grew more complex rather than simpler, driven by the widespread deployment of MIRVs, which multiplied warhead counts without increasing launcher numbers and dramatically increased the potential destructiveness of existing arsenals. MIRVs challenged the assumptions underlying SALT I by exacerbating first strike incentives as highly accurate missiles armed with multiple warheads threatened to destroy an adversary's fixed forces in a single blow, compressing decision times and increasing pressure to act preemptively in a crisis. This development intensified calls for a new round of negotiations, as both superpowers recognized that quantitative limits alone were insufficient to manage the evolving balance. SALT II emerged from this recognition, envisioned as a more comprehensive framework that would impose ceilings on total strategic delivery vehicles and constrain the most destabilizing systems while preserving parity and predictability. Negotiations were arduous and protracted, reflecting not only technical complexity, but shifting political landscapes as leadership changes, domestic opposition, and external crises repeatedly threatened to derail progress. For American negotiators, SALT II had to navigate a political environment increasingly skeptical of détente, where concessions were scrutinized as potential weaknesses and arms control itself became a partisan issue. For Soviet negotiators, the talks unfolded against a backdrop of economic stagnation and growing internal rigidity, which heightened the stakes of achieving limits that could slow costly competition without signaling retreat. Despite these obstacles, the two sides eventually reached agreement in 1979, establishing limits on strategic launchers and attempting to regulate MIRVs through sub-ceilings and definitions that reflected painstaking compromise. The resulting treaty was complex, fragile, and controversial, hailed by supporters as a necessary step toward stability and condemned by critics as unverifiable or inadequate. Yet its very existence testified to the depth of anxiety shared by both superpowers about the trajectory of the arms race. Even as the treaty was signed, however, the international environment was deteriorating as trust eroded and geopolitical tensions resurfaced, raising questions about whether the fragile framework of restraint could survive renewed confrontation. SALT II thus entered history suspended between aspiration and reality, embodying the Cold War's attempt to slow itself at a moment when the forces driving escalation were once again gathering strength and setting the stage for a crisis that would test whether arms control could endure when political conditions turned hostile. The fate of SALT II was sealed not by its technical provisions, but by the return of Cold War fear, as the fragile political environment that had made restraint possible collapsed under the weight of renewed confrontation, exposing how dependent arms control had always been on broader strategic confidence rather than on treaties alone. In the United States, the agreement faced fierce opposition almost immediately, criticized as codifying Soviet advantages and constraining American modernization at a moment when perceptions of Soviet assertiveness were hardening. While in the Soviet Union, the treaty was viewed less as a step toward cooperation than as a necessary pause in a competition that could not be sustained indefinitely. This mutual ambivalence meant that SALT II survived on momentum rather than conviction, vulnerable to any shock that could disrupt the delicate balance between restraint and rivalry. That shock arrived in December 1979, when Soviet forces entered Afghanistan, transforming an already fragile détente into open distrust and fundamentally altering the political calculus surrounding arms control. For Washington, the invasion confirmed the worst suspicions of critics who argued that the Soviet Union was exploiting cooperation in strategic weapons to pursue expansion elsewhere, and the political space needed to ratify SALT II evaporated almost overnight. President Jimmy Carter withdrew the treaty from Senate consideration, signaling that formal endorsement of restraint was no longer politically viable, even as both sides quietly continued to observe its limits. This decision illustrated one of the central paradoxes of Cold War arms control, that treaties could be honored in practice while being rejected in principle, their utility acknowledged privately, even as they became liabilities in public debate. Throughout the early 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union largely adhered to SALT II's ceilings, not out of goodwill, but because abandoning them outright risked accelerating an arms race that neither side believed it could safely manage. This informal compliance underscored the extent to which arms control had become embedded in strategic planning, shaping expectations and assumptions even in the absence of formal ratification. Yet, the broader atmosphere of the Cold War was shifting decisively toward confrontation, as new leadership in Washington embraced a more aggressive posture, emphasizing military buildup, technological innovation, and rhetorical clarity over negotiated restraint. The Reagan administration framed the arms race in moral as well as strategic terms, casting the Soviet Union as an adversary whose system was inherently unstable and whose commitments could not be trusted, a worldview that made reliance on SALT-era frameworks appear naive or dangerous. In response, defense spending surged and new weapons programs were launched, including plans for advanced missiles and missile defense concepts that challenged the core assumptions of the ABM Treaty, signaling a willingness to reconsider limits that had once been regarded as essential to stability. For the Soviet Union, this shift was deeply unsettling, as economic stagnation and technological lag made it increasingly difficult to compete in an unconstrained arms race, intensifying internal debates about sustainability and the cost of maintaining parity. The combination of external pressure and internal weakness created a sense of strategic anxiety that permeated Soviet decision-making, reinforcing fears that the delicate balance achieved through SALT was unraveling. Arms control, once framed as a mutual necessity, now appeared contingent and reversible, subject to political winds rather than structural logic. Nevertheless, the experience of SALT-ing and SALT II continued to exert influence beneath the surface, as planners on both sides recognized that even aggressive postures operated within constraints shaped by decades of negotiated limits and shared understanding. The language of ceilings, verification, and stability had entered the strategic vocabulary, altering how competition was conceived even when cooperation faltered. The collapse of SALT-II as a formal agreement thus did not erase its impact, but it did expose the vulnerability of arms control to shifts in trust and perception, revealing that treaties could slow escalation only so long as leaders believed the alternative was worse. This realization set the stage for the most dangerous phase of the late Cold War, when fear of imbalance and technological surprise once again threatened to overwhelm restraint, and when the question became not whether the arms race could be slowed, but whether it could be prevented from accelerating beyond control, a question that would dominate strategic thinking until a new generation of leaders confronted the system's limits with renewed urgency. By the early 1980s, the legacy of SALT-I and SALT-II had entered a dangerous liminal phase, as the structures designed to slow the arms race remained in place, even while the political confidence that sustained them was eroding, creating a condition in which deterrence depended increasingly on habit rather than consensus and on inherited assumptions rather than renewed agreement. This was a period when both superpowers possessed arsenals capable of ending civilization many times over, yet lacked a shared framework robust enough to reassure each side that the other would not exploit moments of crisis or technological transition, and the absence of trust magnified the significance of every exercise, deployment, and doctrinal shift. In Washington, the emphasis on rearmament and strategic modernization reflected a belief that strength was the only reliable guarantor of peace. But this belief coexisted uneasily with the recognition, forged during SALT negotiations, that unchecked competition carried existential risks, a contradiction that shaped policy even as rhetoric hardened. In Moscow, the perception that the United States was abandoning restraint intensified fears of encirclement and surprise, reinforcing a defensive mindset that interpreted Western actions through the lens of worst-case scenarios, a tendency exacerbated by aging leadership, rigid institutions, and intelligence systems prone to confirmation bias. The residual influence of SALT was evident in how both sides continued to monitor each other's compliance with informal limits, treating deviations not merely as military developments, but as signals of intent. And this signaling environment made misinterpretation particularly dangerous, as technical changes could be read as preparations for attack. The arms race thus entered a phase where escalation was driven less by numerical growth than by anxiety over qualitative advantage, as advances in accuracy, command and control, and early warning systems created fears that deterrence itself might be eroding. This fear was compounded by the memory of near catastrophes, including incidents in which false alarms or misread signals had brought leaders dangerously close to irreversible decisions, reinforcing awareness that the margin for error was shrinking even as arsenals grew more sophisticated. SALT's greatest contribution during this period was not the ceilings it imposed, but the habits of communication and verification it had fostered, habits that allowed each side to interpret ambiguous developments within a shared conceptual framework rather than through pure suspicion. Without these habits, the early 1980s might have proven even more volatile, as crises layered atop one another without the stabilizing influence of precedent and procedure. Yet the limitations of SALT were equally apparent, as the agreements had failed to constrain the most destabilizing trends in nuclear strategy, particularly the emphasis on counterforce targeting and the pursuit of technologies that promised decisive advantage in the opening moments of conflict. This failure underscored a central lesson of arms control, that slowing the race required not only limits on numbers, but a shared understanding of what constituted stability, an understanding that remained contested and fragile. As tensions peaked during this period, with heightened alert levels and mutual suspicion, the question of whether the Cold War could be managed indefinitely through deterrence alone grew increasingly urgent. The experience of SALT I and SALT II had demonstrated that restraint was possible, but also that it was reversible, dependent on political will, and vulnerable to external shocks. This realization set the stage for a renewed push toward arms control later in the decade, driven by leaders who recognized that the system they had inherited was approaching the limits of sustainability. When negotiations resumed in earnest in the mid-1980s, they did so against the backdrop of SALT's mixed legacy, informed by both its achievements and its failures, and animated by the understanding that slowing the arms race was no longer a choice, but a necessity. In this sense, SALT I and SALT II functioned as a bridge between eras, marking the transition from an unrestrained competition for superiority to a grudging acceptance that survival required cooperation, even among adversaries who remained ideologically opposed. The Cold War had not ended, but it had been forced to confront itself, and the attempt to slow its momentum through SALT revealed both the possibilities and the limits of managing a system built on fear, mistrust, and unprecedented destructive power. The ultimate meaning of SALT I and SALT II only became fully visible in hindsight as the Cold War approached its final decade, and the cumulative weight of nuclear overcapacity, economic strain, and systemic risk forced a reckoning that earlier generations of leaders had postponed, because what SALT represented was not success in halting the arms race, but the first admission that it could not be allowed to continue indefinitely without courting disaster. These agreements exposed a fundamental truth that neither superpower had been willing to acknowledge openly in the early years of rivalry, that deterrence based on endless accumulation was unsustainable, not merely financially or politically, but psychologically, as leaders, systems, and societies struggled to live under the constant shadow of instantaneous annihilation. The slow, halting progress of SALT revealed how deeply entrenched the logic of competition had become, and how difficult it was to reverse momentum once institutions, doctrines, and identities had been built around the pursuit of strategic advantage. Yet even in their limitations, SALT I and SALT II reshaped expectations, establishing the idea that nuclear stability was something that could be negotiated, managed, and measured, rather than left to chance or unilateral assertion. This shift mattered profoundly because it reframed restraint not as weakness, but as responsibility, and introduced a new metric of power based on control rather than accumulation. The generation of leaders who later pursued deeper reductions drew directly on this legacy, having internalized the lesson that arms control was not a concession to an adversary, but a means of preventing systems from overwhelming the political objectives they were meant to serve. The failures of SALT II, particularly its collapse amid renewed confrontation, underscored the fragility of this approach, demonstrating that agreements could slow escalation only so long as leaders believed the risks of restraint were lower than the risks of competition. When that belief eroded, the machinery of escalation resumed with alarming speed, reminding both sides how narrow the margin of safety had become. It was this recognition, forged through years of near misses, false alarms, and spiraling complexity, that eventually opened the door to more ambitious agreements later in the Cold War. Agreements that sought not merely to cap growth, but to reverse it, dismantling entire classes of weapons whose existence had come to be seen as inherently destabilizing. SALT thus occupies a paradoxical place in history, remembered neither as a decisive breakthrough nor as a failure, but as a necessary precursor, a painful learning process through which the superpowers discovered that managing their rivalry required limits, transparency, and an acceptance of mutual vulnerability. The effort to slow the Cold War through SALT did not resolve the conflict, but it altered its trajectory, introducing friction into an arms race that might otherwise have accelerated unchecked until systems failed or decisions outran judgment. In this sense, SALT I and SALT II represent the moment when the Cold War began to recognize its own unsustainability, when the architects of deterrence confronted the reality that power without restraint threatened to destroy the very states it was meant to protect. The legacy of these agreements lies not in the numbers they froze, but in the mindset they forced into existence, a mindset that acknowledged that survival in the nuclear age depended less on winning than on not losing control, and that slowing the race was itself a form of strategic success. This recognition did not come easily, nor did it arrive all at once, but it marked the beginning of a long, uneven process through which the Cold War gradually learned to live with its own dangers, buying time not through victory, but through negotiated hesitation. The final legacy of SALT I and SALT II is not found in the precise limits they imposed or the clauses that were debated and contested, but in the way they revealed that the Cold War had reached a stage where speed, scale, and automation were beginning to outrun human judgment, forcing the superpowers to confront the uncomfortable fact that their greatest enemy was no longer each other alone, but the systems they had built to deter one another. By the time SALT faded as a formal framework, both Washington and Moscow understood, even if they did not always admit publicly, that nuclear arsenals had grown so vast and so complex that the margin for error had narrowed to an almost intolerable degree, where misinterpretation, technical malfunction, or institutional momentum could trigger consequences beyond political control. SALT had not stopped this process, but it had slowed it enough to allow reflection, creating space for a generation of leaders, analysts, and negotiators to grasp that stability depended on restraint as much as strength, and that deterrence without limits was indistinguishable from risk without end. The agreements demonstrated that even bitter adversaries could recognize shared danger and act to manage it, not out of trust or goodwill, but out of fear grounded in experience. A fear sharpened by near disasters and by the dawning realization that no defense could fully protect against weapons designed to overwhelm all defenses. When deeper reductions eventually became possible, they rested on the intellectual and institutional foundations laid by SALT, on the habits of verification, dialogue, and cautious compromise that had been forged during years when slowing the race seemed like the most ambitious goal imaginable. The Cold War did not end because SALT succeeded, but it might not have survived long enough to end at all without the pause that SALT imposed, a pause that allowed leaders to recognize the limits of power and the necessity of control. In this sense, SALT I and SALT II stand as the moment when the Cold War first attempted to restrain itself, when the logic of accumulation collided with the reality of annihilation, and when survival began to depend not on how fast weapons could be built or launched, but on whether the systems governing them could be slowed, questioned, and ultimately reversed. Their story is one of reluctant self-awareness, of a rivalry forced to confront its own excesses, and of a world that came to understand, just barely in time, that managing danger was the only path left between dominance and destruction.